Thog from the Slithering Shadow.
It's packed to the gills with evil. It is just completely foul. It's the worst possible villainous monster ever.
He beats the crap out of Conan. He's ripped to shreds by this thing.
He is as messed up as he ever gets in any original Conan story.
Smash that subscribe button. Join Conan and conquer YouTube. We know what you need. Official Conan the Barbarian merch, art prints, t-shirts, mugs, and so much more. Head on over to the official Heroic Signature store to claim all the treasures you see. Welcome to the show, our regular lore expert, Jeff Shanks.
Hey, guys.
And special guest, one of my favorite people in the Conan universe, John C. Hocking. Talking about monsters was the perfect excuse to get both of you together. One of my personal favorites I'd like to start with, because it appears in not one, but two stories, is Thulsa, the giant serpent. So Thulsa appears most famously in the Scarlet Citadel, and then later on in the Valley of the Worm, where he's grown much larger. But what do you guys think about Thulsa?
I'm on record championing the Scarlet Citadel and talking about the specific scenes with Thulsa as being kind of my favorite parts of the story, which is, there's a lot of wonderful parts to the Scarlet Citadel, which is like a tremendously influential fantasy story. But Thulsa is built up so well. When you first, he's a poisonous constrictor. The fellow comes down to mock Conan while Conan's chained to the wall in the dungeon, and Thulsa strikes him and then coils around him, and you can hear his bones snap. So he's a terrifying monster. It slinks away, bearing its prey, while Conan's like, well, what good thing it didn't pick on me. And when Conan gets loose, he wanders on, and even the other creatures in the dungeon, of which there's any number, and they are pretty gross and horrifying, even they are afraid of Thulsa and will flee before it if they think it's coming. It's just wonderful. So you have this huge, really strong foreshadowing buildup. And now you would probably think that, given in a story like that, you have a foe that terrifying, that Conan's going to come to grips with it. Obviously it's inevitable that Conan will be duking it out and trying to kill Thulsa, but that's not the way it shakes out, does it?
I think that's one of the coolest things about Thulsa, right? And that it's that, here he introduces him. Here is this big bad, this giant creature, right? And there's giant snakes throughout, most of Howard's stories, not just the Conan stories. You see giant snakes, throughout. That's one of his favorite go-to creatures. And you think you're building up to this showdown. Conan's going to have to fight this giant snake at some point, but no, this is a huge giant monster that survives the story without Conan killing it because it's so badass, right? Conan's even I'm not even messing with that, right? Thulsa it's hard to catch because it's kind of subtle in the way Howard describes him, but he's also, he's pale and colorless almost, right? He's been underground for so long, right? He's almost a pale underground serpent. I also think one of the coolest things is that Howard, as you said, does bring him back. And he does it in a way that helps Howard subtly establish his world building. Valley of the Worm was published in Weird Tales, just like Scarlet Citadel was. It was, several months later when Valley of the Worm came out. Folks that may not be familiar with Valley of the Worm as they might be with Scarlet Citadel, the Conan story. Valley of the Worm is one of Howard's James Allison stories. James Allison is a person living in the contemporary times, Howard's contemporary times, the 1930s, who has memories of his past lives, and most of his past lives are of lives where he was a barbarian warrior, an Aesir warrior, usually in the thousands and thousands of years in the past. And, it's not entirely clear, unless you really follow along, but most of those stories, he's remembering past lives in the aftermath of the Hyborian age, right? The other ones, the other stories are Marches of Valhalla, Garden of Fear, which I suspect we're going to be talking about later.
Yeah, we'll talk about Garden of Fear later, because that has the winged Yagas.
But Valley of the Worm takes place in these ruins, right, where you have an Aesir warrior and a Pict sidekick. And if you're familiar with Howard's essay, The Hyborian Age, where he talks about the aftermath of the Hyborian kingdoms when they do collapse and you have invasions of Picts, and then the Nordheimers, the Aesir and the Vanir come down from the north, and they're wandering around the world. That is when this story is set, right? And this Aesir warrior encounters Thulsa, the giant snake, again. Right? But this is hundreds of years probably after the time of Conan.
He's even more badass now. He's huge.
Even more badass, right? He's got bigger. He's not underground anymore, right? He's like inside, wandering around in this area where there's these ruins, so it kind of implies, this would have been a hint to the regular readers of Weird Tales. Oh, hey, it's that giant snake. This is after the fall of the Hyborian kingdoms, right? So it's almost like a Hyborian age post-apocalyptic story, where, it's taking place, in the ruins of Koth. Right? In the ruins of the Hyborian kingdom, where now Satha is on the surface and wandering around.
Well, I agree with John, though, about the Scarlet Citadel just being one of the more underrated and cooler Conan stories. You and I are big horror fans, so maybe that's part of it. But Satha is a big part. But another creature I want to get your guys' thought on, since we're on the subject, is Yafka the Devil Flower, which appears in the Scarlet Citadel.
I used to imagine Clark Ashton Smith just going, "Oh, that's got to be great."
That's a Clark Ashton Smith, point out there for sure, 100%. Mixing cosmic horror like in there with sword and sorcery, absolutely.
Good thing you didn't try to uproot it, Conan. Its roots are in hell.
Right, its roots extend into hell. Right. The cool thing is he mentions the planet Yog with this. Right. He had. The previous story before the Scarlet Citadel, right before that, was Tower of the Elephant, right? Where we get Yog Kosha from Yog. So this is one of the great things when you actually read the Conan stories in the order they were written, not in the artificial, let's put them all in Conan's career chronology order. You see how Howard would plant seeds in one story, and then in the next story, he'll take off with that and run with it a little bit, right? And that's one of my favorite moments, right? So we've established now that there's this other alien planet, Yog, within the Howard verse, basically. And he's done this now in 2 stories right in a row. It's cool.
What do you like most about that creature, John? As you mentioned, it's got cosmic elements to it. It's traveled through space for who knows, eons maybe.
So we're talking about the plant that was holding Pelias prisoner.
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Just the simple fact that the plant in this case is being used as a grotesque sort of prison for this character. That's really horrible. Yeah, the whole idea that there would be a creature that would just basically, it presses its blossom to his face, basically for decades, forever, that's and holds him mentally and physically imprisoned. And the fact that Conan felt kind of obliged to release the guys was pretty cool too. And Pelias turns out to be pretty handy. A good guy to have in the dungeon.
One of the more horrifying scenes in a Conan story, without question. Pretty haunting.
I mean, you get this idea too, like in fiction all the time now, that during that period, the idea the devil plants, the carnivorous plants in the jungles in Africa and things like that were man-eating plants and things. And this is kind of a take on that, but a alien take.
What's the Clark Ashton Smith story where the 2 guys are in the boats floating down the river and one of them is infected with the seed from the sepulcher?
Seed from the sepulcher.
Where it grows through the guy's head, which is, that's some pretty chilling stuff right there.
Right. This is good stuff.
So we also mentioned Kosha, right? Obviously, there's lots of different things at play in Howard's world. We got interdimensional beings, potentially. We have races that grew before mankind and evolved and devolved. And then we have aliens, right? Kosha. Let's talk a little bit more about Kosha. I'm not sure I want to call him a monster. He's a very intelligent being, right?
That's the beauty of it, is because he is a monster, especially to Conan's eyes. Conan sees this completely unnatural and bizarre creature, and the triumph of that story, or one of its many triumphs, if you ask me, is that this otherworldly entity has been enslaved and tortured. And I mean, what the hell? Conan walks in to see it, and he's like, have you come to torture me again, Yara? Is there no end to your agony? And Conan feels for it. He extends a measure of compassion, sympathy, understanding to a completely alien creature that ordinarily would have him drawing his sword or fleeing. Great piece of work, man. It's
one of the things that I really love about this story, and it's one of the reasons why Tower of the Elephant is one of my go-to recommends for new readers.
Absolutely.
Because what it does, exactly what John said here, Howard subverts your expectations with this, right? You're going into this thinking, okay, it's sword and sorcery, right? It's a barbarian killing monsters, get the woman, get the treasure, blah, 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 right? And then it's completely turned on its ear, right? The monster is the victim here, right? And is actually this beautiful creature in a lot of ways. That's such an incredible thing. It's also, if you pick up the subtext that Howard's playing with here, it's Howard doing his sort of pseudo-euhemerism thing, right? Where Howard loves to do this, where the Hyborian age, these forgotten eras in the past, are the origins of our mythology and legends today, right? And so you have this elephant-headed deity, right, Yagkosha, which is basically the prototype for Ganesha. This, it's an ancient alien thing, right? It's an alien that came down and was worshipped as a god in the East, this figure, right? And so Howard's kind of throwing that out there. But one of the things talking about this, we're talking about this as monsters, right? Monster in finger quotes. One of the things that kind of annoys me a little bit about artistic depictions of Yagkosha, beginning with the very first depiction of him in Weird Tales, is they just do him as a straight human body, elephant head. And that's not really what Howard is describing, right? He's really describing this alien being, and it does have a long proboscis and large ears and things like that. But an elephant is just the closest thing that Conan can come up with to compare it to. And so I wish artists would take a little bit more liberties with it and create a more alien looking creature, even if it does have these sort of features, right?
Yeah, I think the Dark Horse comic did a pretty decent job with straying away from the giant elephant head and making him look a little bit more alien in nature. We've discussed this because we want to make an action figure of Yagkosha eventually, and we're like, we got to find the right depiction.
Talk to me. Don't go trust me, right? Because if you see, there's several inspirations for it, right? Like Frank R. Paul, and John, you may know some of this, like in Amazing Stories, you would see Frank R. Paul, the famous early science fiction artist, would often depict his Martians as having big ears and a long nose. And you see his Martian all the time. And it's the basics for, the sort of elephant looking Martian, right? That he drew all the time. And it's very possible Howard would have seen that, on the stands, in Amazing and some of those places, right? So, but also, Frank Belknap Long created an elephant-like, sort of Lovecraftian entity too.
Chalknar Fawn. Get that. Is it Chalknar?
Thunder. Yeah. Yes. I can never pronounce it either.
You're not supposed to. It's not meant for human tongues anyway, dude. So you're fine.
Right. Yes. That also created this alien-like, it's a Lovecraftian creature, but elephant-headed kind of thing. And modern artists do a pretty good job with Frank Belknap Long's creature. But again, in Weird Tales, it's just you see the original illustration, it's just an elephant thing. But that also, certainly Howard saw that, right? A couple of years before in the Horror from the Hills. So that was also an inspiration. So he's very consciously trying to play, again, he's, in that, Lovecraftian, sandbox with the others, with Yagkosha as well.
And it's got a few other little beasties within this story. We got the giant spiders that if he faces one of them kills Taurus. You guys would know better than me. Do spiders come into play in any other Howard stories, like the large spiders, or is this the only example?
Well, the giant spider in Tower of the Elephant is wonderful because, of course, it takes out Taurus when Taurus goes in, and Taurus comes staggering out, and Conan basically kind of catches him as he falls, and there's punctures in the back of his neck. And the punctures reek. The poison is so nasty, it stinks even after the bite.
It's
bogus.
So good. God,
you do not
good.
want to be bit by that thing. And the fight with is actually relatively short, but has a wonderful poetic conclusion as Conan crushes it under smashes it beneath a chest of gems so that the gems in the spider's ichor are splattered across the ground. Powerful purple prose there. Beautiful stuff.
It's awesome. It makes you wonder if these spiders were created through sorcery. Were there giants? Did Howard think there was giant spiders like in the Hyborian age, or maybe these were just fabricated through magic or enlarged from a smaller species? Like, who knows?
That's a great question. He kind of leaves it open, right? There was an earlier Weird Tales in 1925 or 26 story by what's his name, Powers, his last name, that made the cover. And there's an early cover of a guy fighting a giant spider or whatever. So I guess it had been that may have been his inspiration for it. There is another, I'm trying to remember, there was a normal sized spider, that ends up playing a role in, what was it? Was it People of the Black Circle? I forget now. Right. But I don't think there were, I can't think of any other examples of giant spiders, but, and I don't even really, other than that one Weird Tales cover, I don't know how much that was a thing, right? It becomes a thing in Tolkien later.
Oh, yeah.
But that's later, right? And obviously in D&D, giant spiders are a staple. But yeah, it kind of reminds you just how much of a pioneer, even in things that we take for granted, like giant monsters and stuff that are, ubiquitous in fantasy today.
I'd imagine arachnophobia has been around since the dawn of man.
Spiders are a national enemy. Yeah.
How about another of my favorite Conan monsters Thog from the Slithering Shadow. So the Slithering Shadow, Thog, this is a Lovecraftian entity. I know this is your court, John.
Yeah, well, see, you suggested that we pick out our favorite, and Thog is. I understand that some people are not that fond of Zithal of the Dusk. That it's the Slithering Shadow that's not everybody's favorite Conan story, but it's one of my absolute favorites, and it's entirely because of Thog and this hideous monster's conflict with Conan. Which arguably, well, look, man, this is the most perfect example of Howard sort of buckling down and saying, creating a Lovecraftian monster. I mean, you never really get a great look at it. It's horrible beyond imagination. It's blob-like, it's tentacled, it's got scorpion whipped talons. It's packed to the gills with evil. It is just completely foul. It's the worst possible villainous monster ever. And Conan comes to grips with it. I think it's almost a tribute to Lovecraft in that when Howard has his most Howardian character, Conan, clash with this extremely Lovecraftian monstrosity. It's basically a standoff, you know. It gets beat out of it, then slinks off down its hole. But you get to see Conan after, and he is as messed up as he ever gets in any original Conan story.
100%.
He is completely shredded.
This is what I was going to say here. This is also why I love Thog, right? Because he beats the crap out of Conan. His skin's like coming off in layers and stuff. He's ripped to shreds by this thing. You know, I'm with you 100% on this one, John. You don't ever get to see that. People today, a lot of times people criticize Conan. Oh, well, he's kind of a male Mary Sue kind of character and blah, 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 blah. Not in this story. Not against Thog, right? Thog tears him to pieces. You get, and this one, I think there's actually, while Thog is described in Lovecraftian terms of tentacles and things like that and amorphous, and you don't really get a physical, there's hints that it's kind of like in one part that it has kind of a toad-like kind of thing going on too, right? Which is also like something, I had the pleasure along those lines, in trying to, take this description that's really all over the place. But I was really fortunate with the Modiphius game, to art direct most of the covers for the books and got to work with some incredible artists. And with this one, I got to art direct, Gerald Brom, doing his depiction of Thog that became the cover of the main book and trying to, he's got to paint it. Like, how do you visualize this creature? Right. And, it took a little bit of work and a little bit of back and forth, and Brom is an incredibly gracious and professional guy to work with. Thank God. And I think he did an amazing job. If you're familiar with the cover, in trying to capture the toad-like thing, it's hard to make it solid. You have to, when you're trying to actually, we're going to have to make a two-dimensional image of it, right? But trying to capture what Howard did with this creature is so cool. I want to throw this out there too. You have Thog, but you also have Thaug, right? In A Witch Shall Be Born, right? THAUG instead of THOG. Yeah. Again, this giant toad-like monstrosity, a little more solid than Thog.
But that disappointingly, Thog, THUG, gets taken down by a couple flights of arrows. And disappointing. Come on, it's like Godzilla shows up and then gets shot down by the jets. No, come on. Come on, man. There should have been more to it than that. In Savage Sword of Conan, the adaptation to Roy Thomas and John Buscema did, that Conan actually clashes with the beast and sticks his sword in its eye and what happy stuff like that.
I feel like Which Shall Be Born was the story that I got that I got tasked with for the Blackgate did the thing where they randomly assigned you a Conan story and you had to argue that it's the best Conan story, even if it's not. And one of the things I pointed out there, and it really feels like that story just needed one more editorial pass, one more draft, and I think that he would have done something like with that. I think he would have realized, but that keeping on the concept of monsters, right? Howard seemed to like these Lovecraftian toad-like monsters, right? Because you also get it in the Black Stone, you get, this creature there. You get the Temple of the Toad in the thing on the roof, right? And I suspect that this is in some ways his tribute to Clark Ashton Smith's creation, Tsathoggua, which is this kind of, sometimes it's kind of a hairy bat kind of thing, but it's also more toad-like, this creature. And what's kind of cool about that is that Clark Ashton Smith created Tsathoggua. This, that was kind of one of his big contributions to the Lovecraftian mythos, his monster, right? But it was Howard who first used Tsathoggwa's name in print. So Clark Ashton Smith, wrote both Lovecraft and Howard talking about this creature he's coming up with, Tsathoggua, had it in a story that was submitted. And both Lovecraft and Howard was, oh, I love that name. We'll both use it in our stories. They both used it in stories, also submitted. And just because of the weirdness of how things got published, in Weird Tales, both Howard and Lovecraft's story mentioning Tsathoggua were published before Clark Ashton Smith's story. And so Howard, it was actually Children of the Night, the Conrad and Kirwan story, where he mentions Tsathoggua in it, right? But Tsathoggua, Thaug, it's almost like it's even with the name, it's like he's giving kind of a nod to it, right? That whatever these creatures are almost like spawn of Tsathoggua kind of creatures. These toad-like things that are in a bunch of his stories, these Lovecraftian.
So with these frog-like entities, Thaug, where do you guys think they come from? Are they interdimensional? Are they fleas from like another dimension, essentially, like of a much larger entity? Like that'd be pretty damning. What are your thoughts on it?
I think with Thog from Slithering Shadow, aka Zuthal of the Dusk, I think that's clearly supposed to be a Lovecraftian entity that, from another realm entirely, from a realm that's not entirely natural to the world that we know. So it's a being from outside. What his status was there is anybody's guess, I suppose. By mentioning fleas, I think you're calling up the almost incidental Lovecraftian entity that shows up in Veil of Lost Women, because Conan does say something along those lines. Those things are as thick as fleas out there around the world. Very casual response by Conan to this, horrific monstrosity from outer space. But okay, that's one of the other slightly questionable things about that particular story.
What's interesting about that is that Conan seemed to have the knowledge. So it's like almost, where did he get that knowledge from?
He's been facing down Lovecraftian monsters for a while now.
I mean, and I think the term that it is actually used there is the outer dark, right? Which does sort of imply either outer space or extra dimensional, even, right? Or both, right? I mean, at this time, you kind of get that idea, I think, in a lot of the Lovecraftian fiction. It's easy for us we think about outer space in much more mechanistic terms now because we know so much more about it, right? But there was almost an extra dimensional kind of concept between that, when these guys were writing in the 20s and 30s. And yeah, this creature is supposed to be, I think this is that version, that idea of extra dimensional, right? That creature in Veil of Lost Women. And I think that's what Howard's getting at with this whole outer dark idea. That's what people in the Hyborian age, sorcerers calling these entities down, might have referred to it as, right? But I think that is sort of that idea of this sort of extra dimensional idea. And that was a really popular idea at the time. We're not that far after Einstein's, coming out with relativity and these ideas of the time as a fourth dimension, and people were speculating what would a fourth spatial dimension look like, and those kinds of things. And you see that in a lot of the science fiction and, early science fiction, early fantasy in the 20s, right? Lovecraft loved that idea. He was playing with it, and Howard was doing that too, right? You see that throughout. That's where we get all these Lovecraftian extra dimensional entities, Howard was doing that too.
Well, speaking of winged creatures, how about I just call them Yagas, right? We got Queen of the Black Coast, the Garden of Fear, and then we got Almeric, right? They're all talking about these winged creatures. Jeff, you told me that your theory is that the beasts at the end of Queen of the Black Coast are a devolved form of these entities. So let's talk about them.
Well, sounds like a good theory to me. I was just about to go, wait a minute, wasn't it seem more ape-like? I don't think it's quite like the Yagas, right. So...
If you listen to the story, right, they were a civilization, and now thousands of years later, this one that survived has slowly devolved over time, this one survivor.
Yeah, geez, it's the last of its race, a little pathos in there. And
that's typical Howardian devolution kind of stuff, right?
I mean, it certainly deals with that motif of deep time, right? Races evolving, devolving throughout time. So I really like it. And I've kind of taken that and I've just run with it. Like that's how I look at the world now. It's like this universe is that this is a species from another world that came here and it's an offshoot. and they come throughout in these various stories in different forms. What are your thoughts just on this species, like that is seen again in Garden of Fear, Queen of the Black Coast?
I mean, I think it's not coincidental, right? I think Howard was, I think it's something that's kind of, except for maybe some of the hardcore people that really look at this stuff, I think it's kind of escaped people's notice that he kept using this ancient pre-human winged race, right? And then when you get to Almeric and you find out they're actually from another planet, it kind of implies that, and it was an idea that Howard was, it evolved over time through these stories as he was playing with them, but that, this may have been a pre-human race that did not actually originate on Earth. Maybe they came here, million years ago or whatever, right? And had civilizations long before humans. I'll throw out this too. I'm less sure about it, but Wings of the Night.
Yes, the Solomon Kane story.
As well, the Solomon Kane story, you get the harpies, right? That are also these winged creatures. That's kind of where they first appear. And they're a little different in that story.
They're like cursed, right?
Yeah, they're cursed, right? But that may have been where Howard was first toying with the idea of this ancient winged race, right? And then in later stories, he kind of worked it into his, more of his, longer timeline, right? Even in the Cull story, you get, in the Shadow Kingdom, where he mentions the different types of races that have existed before. There's the Bat people or whatever, right? Right. Maybe that's what he's referring to, right? So yeah, I think Howard was kind of playing with this idea. I think it was an idea that kind of evolved over time. The idea that there was, in Howard, you get the idea that there were all these pre-human races, and this seems to have been one of them. And he didn't really develop it very overtly, but you keep seeing them in all these stories where he would play with them,
Well, that's a perfect segue, Jeff, talking about these pre-human races prior to the Thurian Age. Let's talk about some of them. Now, this is way before Conan's time, even before Cull, right? We got to talk about the Serpent Men a little bit here. And then there's werewolves, is that right? So let's talk about some of these pre-human races. Jeff, you're the main authority on this. Lead us off.
Well, that same line in the Shadow Kingdom, the Shadow Kingdom itself, of course, introduces the Serpent Men, right? In that line I was just talking about, it's Brule talking about the other races that, existed, not just the Serpent Men. There was also the Wolf people and the Bat people and the blah, 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 blah. So let's start with the Serpent Men, right? But it all does kind of tie in. What time is it? How long do we have, right? Because we can go down this is a deep rabbit hole, right?
I definitely want to get your thoughts on the Serpent Men from the Shadow Kingdom, John, because it's such a cool piece of pop culture.
First off, both you guys say Ka Nama Kalaj Rama. Okay, let's hear it. Spit it up.
I can't do it. I'm like Ash in Army of Darkness. I'll just mess it up. Kwakdu, Nakdu, Marada.
Here, I said it.
I said the words. Well, more or less.
Did you practice that?
No, it obviously it's a concept that's stuck fast. I mean, you can see echoes of that through pop culture all over the place, even today, which is in some strange fashion. I'm sure you're aware of that, Mr. Shanks. And this seems, yeah. Well, who would have thought that, a cool piece of Pulp Fiction from back in the day would have had so much resonance and it would keep bopping around the pop culture sphere. But yeah, there's just something wonderful about, it looks and sounds just like my best friend, but it's a snake. That's pretty chilling. That's pretty frightening. The scene where Cull is he's going through a secret passage and he finds all of his Red Slayers dead. That's a disturbing scene. It's like, well, no, wait a minute. They're up there messing around. No, they're not. They're actually dead. Those people you think are your friends and protectors are actually serpents. Which is a pretty fine, chilling moment.
It is scary. Really, there's so many examples of this concept or these monsters throughout pop culture. One of my favorites being the Slee Stacks in Land of the Lost, which is fun. Because even though it's a children's program and you can see the zippers on the back of those suits, they're terrifying.
They're scary. Yes, they are.
Some pretty crazy ideas. Also, deep time is a big thing in Land of the Lost, right? The Slee Stacks have devolved from a more intelligent race.
I was 4 years old when that came out. I was watching that at like 4 or 5 when it came out. It scared the piss out of me, right? I didn't see them as fake. The Slee Stacks, when they came on screen,
yeah, that was creepy, man.
It's creepy. There is something primal, right? That fear, that maybe it's something, it's evolutionary, right, in us. This primal fear of serpents, right? That that maybe we have as humans that go back, millions of years in our evolutionary history, right? There is something there, right? You talked about spiders earlier. this fear of spiders, but humans have this fear of snakes too that goes way back.
It's like it's just the maybe influenced also just by like the unpredictableness of mankind. Like you don't know who you're talking to, psychopaths, greed, a lot of things that Howard probably witnessed during the Texas oil boom that influenced a lot of his work. Maybe he was influenced by that, the devil in disguise.
Absolutely. Great observation. 100%. Because John alluded to it, right? That's what really does make them. It's not just that they're serpent people, right? They're not just lizard folk, right? It's the shape shifting that really makes them terrifying.
The profound deception.
The deception, right? The paranoia that creates that you can't trust anything you don't know, right? That's what makes them such a complete, fascinating antagonist in the story.
Yeah, man. And then even beyond Serpent Men, it's Invasion of the Body Snatchers, right? They Live, Society, so many. Yeah, that's a gross one. But there's a lot of examples of this monster and throughout all of pulp fiction and pop culture. So, well, how about Thak? Thak, the ape man, rogues of the house. To my understanding, Jeff, in the Hyborian Age essay, they talk about, I'm assuming it's like Yetis almost, right, in a mountainous region. And I'm curious, is Thak, are his origins tied to that species that was mentioned in the Hyborian Age essay? And what do you guys just think of this monster? It's obviously he's immortalized by Frank Frazetta, which is a pretty great thing to have as a monster, right? So
just a wonderful foe for Conan, and notable in that he's bestial and terrifying and inhuman, and yet by the end, Conan regards him basically as a man, as like a worthy foe. As my women will my women will sing of him. It says it's one of the chieftains I've defeated, which is again, Conan being a little bit more aware, sympathetic than you might not necessarily expect him to be. But that by itself kind of elevates Thak a couple notches above your average, Conan monster that a sword sorcery hero might conflict with.
He's got humanity to him.
Yeah, something in there. Yeah.
Let me throw this out there. This is actually something I actually did an essay just on this kind of for a fanzine a few years ago called "What the Thak." Because of course, right? So I've got kind of a controversial idea about that. I think Thak is supposed to represent a Neanderthal, which is kind of sounds crazy. Let me make my case. So Howard used Neanderthals several times in his fiction. He actually would refer to them as beast men in Men of the Shadows. And his very first story, which we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of this year, Spear and Fang, was a story about a Cro-Magnon, right? The more human-like, Cro-Magnon fighting against a beast-like Neanderthal, right? As the antagonist in the story. We also have to remember, in Howard's time, people thought Neanderthals were more ape-like than we know they are today, right? We have a lot more knowledge today. If you look at some of the books that Howard had in his library that depicted Neanderthals, they were very much ape men, right? When you read the description of the Neanderthals in Spear and Fang, his first story that was published in 1925, and you compare it to the description of Thak, they're almost identical. Everything, piggish eyes, all the things, right? You can break it down. And I did this in this one article showing, all of the comparisons between them. Even the combat between the Cro-Magnon and the Neanderthal in Spear and Fang, the sequence of the combat is almost identical to the fight scene between Conan and Thak in the way that it plays out, right? So that is you can tell even in the story, like he describes Thak differently than the other like man apes or ape men in the other Conan stories, right? That idea that there's something more human about Thak. They talk about him not even, like his people living there having, even something of a language that's gibberish or whatever, right? And there's also I mentioned James Allison earlier, right? There is a James Allison fragment that seems to take place right before the Hyborian Age that has a relic Neanderthal in it. So, Howard in his world building, loved to play with this idea of, Neanderthal as these beast men that were around. So what I think Thak was a relic Neanderthal. And his people, that were living in that village or that valley in Zamora or whatever that he talks about where he found them, was probably just one last little group of leftover Neanderthals that had survived. And that's what Thak is. I'll throw this out there too. I love the scene, right, where they approach Thak from behind and he's got the red cape on and they think it's Nabonidus, the red priest. and then there's a scene where then he turns around and you see the horror, right, of this creature trying to mimic his master, trying to mimic humanity. That scene's almost identical to a scene in Murders in the Rue Morgue, where you come up behind the creature and it turns out to be an orangutan when he turns around or whatever, right? That idea of and it's something that you see in a lot of fiction right after Darwin, right? In the late 1800s and early 1900s, is playing with what there's a German literary scholar, like, did a lot of work on this stuff. She calls it anthropological anxiety. Really, it's more like evolutionary anxiety. The idea that because of Darwin now, humans are not special anymore. We're just another animal, right? And there's this fear like, yeah, we've evolved to this point, but if we've evolved here, we could devolve just as easily. Right. And so you've got all these fears of, like, you see this in fiction, during this period, and Howard was 100% playing with all of these ideas. Evolution, devolution. What does it really mean to be human? Are we just an animal? What happens when an animal tries to be human and crosses that line? Right. That's Thak. He's that uncanny, like, liminal creature, in between man and humanity. And when they turn around, what's horrifying about Thak is not his bestial nature when they see him. It's the humanity they see in him.
Yeah, I feel even sorrier for Thak now. It's unfortunate. Poor guy.
Well, transitioning, maybe a little less interesting, but, gray apes, right? They appear in Hour of the Dragon, Iron Shadows in the Moon, and also kind of became, just like giant snakes, kind of like a go-to thing within comics and pastiche for Conan to fight. Just there's so many statues out there of Conan fighting monkeys and giant apes. I mean, what can we say? King Kong was big around the time, just apes in general, probably because of Darwin. And also they were elusive at the time, right? People thought that giant gorillas were a myth for a long time, up until maybe what was it, the late 1800s that they finally got proof of it. But it was fairly new.
Mid 1800s, the mountain gorilla was discovered late in the early 1900s, but lowland gorillas have been around since they've been found in the early 1800s. But yes, it was new, right? And just what I was talking about, like, people were into this idea and arguing about it, right? Scope's monkey trial was just a few years before that. So you see the idea of apes, man apes, like, everywhere on the scale, and Howard played with that.
And from an authorial perspective, I mean, Howard has a incredibly powerful, very strong protagonist in Conan, and you just can't pit him against, one human being after another. A really realistic, obviously larger than life opponent would be an ape. It would be something considered shaped like a man, a believable creature for him to come up against, and the fight it would give a Conan a real challenge. A challenge he overcame any number of times in those stories.
Well, speaking of a real challenge, how about the dragons featured in Red Nails? That's what we'll call them, right? Those are pretty interesting.
Dragons and finger quirks.
Yeah, yes. Everybody kind of recognizes that as being a dinosaur, don't they? I mean, yeah. It doesn't breathe fire. It doesn't have wings and fly around.
Well, Jeff, you kind of really brought it home for me. You mentioned that the bones of old beasts, most likely dinosaurs, that have been brought to life again with sorcery and kind of act as a security system for Zuchotl. And that kind of blew my mind.
Right, but and Howard kind of underplays that, right? Because you get the scene at the beginning where Conan and Valeria, encounter this one, quote, dragon, right? I do think if you read the description, I think Barry Windsor Smith got it right, that it was supposed to be sort of a stegosaurus, because he talked about the
carnivorous stegosaurus.
Stuff like that. A carnivorous stegosaurus, which you mentioned King Kong. There is in King Kong, there's the scene with the stegosaurus. It like stomps on a dude and then goes down and eats.
Yeah.
There's a carnivorous apatosaurus, brontosaurus in there as well, right? Plucks the guy out of a tree.
Yes. Yeah.
They're all carnivorous on Skull Island.
So at the beginning, it just seems like it's a relic stegosaurus, right? At the beginning of the scene. But then later on, you learn that the dragons, right? The necromancers of Zuchotl raised them up from, like, they found all these bones, like bones of these giant creatures, and they resurrected them with necromancy, right? And put them together. So really, they could be a hodgepodge of multiple dinosaur bones put together. So they're almost like these zombie stegosaurus plus whatever else other bones were there, which is way cooler even than just a relic stegosaurus, right? And Howard kind of like undersells that line. It's like a throwaway line later on in the story. I'm like, that's so badass. You should have, zhuzh that up a little bit, right? And, because you almost miss it, if just reading through it.
It glides by just about everybody because Valyria and Conan described the beast as a dragon. I think a lot of people just automatically think dragon, but it's clearly more than that.
It's more than that. Howard put so much more thought into it. It's way cooler than that,
That's why I was hoping the new, we all know the Jurassic Park movies are just getting churned out now, but they were playing with this concept of like misfit dinosaurs, and I was hoping that it'd be, go more B-movie with it and have crazy, combinations of dinosaurs. And the whole thing was a big letdown, but I was like, come on, guys, just have fun with it.
You know what, though?
Yeah.
I just saw there was a recent discovery of some preserved T-Rex skin.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
And it's scaly and bumpy.
Oh, really? So now we're back to scales
again.
No
feathers.
Thank
God. No feathers. T-Rex is not a giant chicken, which very well could have been the case. So I'm happy for that. Like, traditional T-Rex is real.
Well, speaking of scales, how about the child of Set seen in The God in the Bowl? That's a pretty interesting one. What do you guys think?
Another of my favorites, and also because of to our affection for horror fiction, it's presented that the monster in God in the Bowl is presented in a much more horror story style. As you learn, and it's a great Lovecraftian reveal. There's something there, but you don't know what it is. And my favorite part is at one point one of the guardsmen is like, yeah, we saw the rope this Conan thief guy used to get in. It was like coiled up around the top of a pillar. It was kind of big. It's weird, mottled looking. And it's like, and it's never mentioned again. And you, the reader, know, hey, wait a minute. That guy caught a glimpse of a horror out of time and didn't even know it. That's beautiful. So and at the end, you get to go face to face as Conan comes face to face with this horror, and he runs away. He hits the road. So again, it's much more of a traditional horror story conclusion. Is like the horror is almost too much to bear. That's a tremendously underrated story, it seems to me.
I agree. The other thing about it, you see its face. It's not monstrous.
It's beautiful.
It's beautiful. Right?
That's even worse, isn't it?
It's so much worse. So much worse, right? It's that, not even necessarily, the uncanny, right? It's just sort of the beautifully grotesque, almost, of this creature that's almost human-like, but it's snake-like. It's essentially a naga, right? Or presented like that, which, Howard may have encountered in his reading, with, Hindu mythology, that kind of idea. But again, it's also throwing back to this idea when it talks about its origins, like the monster kings, the god kings of the past, right? In Stygia that this thing came from, right? It's could be even the spawn of Set or whatever. It's still playing on that same like serpent men idea, right? Of this pre-human serpent-like race, except it's a reversal of it. Instead of a humanoid body with a serpent head, it's a serpent body with a human head. So I think Howard, he'd already done the Shadow Kingdom a couple of years earlier, and with this idea, he's still playing with this idea, I think, and toying with it, this idea of some kind of pre-human serpent-like race that is, the children of Set or whatever, right? And I think that's what he's playing with here. I think, Nagas, I don't know. This is something I've been kind of working with, trying to figure out, where did Howard get the idea of the serpent men from? Nagas could often appear in human form too. They could shapeshift, right? And so I feel like somewhere he probably picked this up in his reading, this idea of the Naga, and that may have been his inspiration both for this creature in God in the Bowl and the serpent men themselves potentially. But I don't know. Haven't really figured that out yet, but that's kind of what we get here, right? Still playing with this serpent motif.
Well, how about the Phoenix on the Sword, the entity that is summoned in the Phoenix on the Sword? Let's talk about that. That's the first Conan story, started as a Cull story. He mentions it's like baboon, almost like baboon or hound-like.
Yeah, but it's a baboon, but it looks like a mummy as well. Yeah, it's that's Thothamon's sending, right? It's like, go get the ring, kill who's wearing it, and whoever's with him. I remember. Yeah.
And it's the demon that's kind of summoned by the ring, right? So it's somehow tied to this ring. Something else Howard probably saw somewhere else, Thoth, the Egyptian god Thoth is usually identified with the ibis, but he can also be identified with the babit. And so he probably picked that up somewhere as well, too.
I did not know that.
Yeah. And that's probably something, because it's this like mummified baboon, like, again, creature probably from the outer dark or whatever, right? Like, he didn't have that term yet, but he's thinking along those lines, summoning this demon-like creature that the ring has control over, and he can control it. And later on, you get the Haunter of the Ring, the John Kirwan story that's set in the 1930s, where the Ring of Thoth-Amon has made it down through the millennia, right? And shows up in this Lovecraftian occult detective story, right? And there it has some other kind of abilities, but it also has this creature that it summons. And it doesn't fully appear at the end. It starts to materialize, but it's still kind of shadow-like. But it's that same creature, like being summoned again, and the readers of Weird Tales, again, would have known that, right? Howard was, all these guys, they were writing to the regular readers, right? The guys that were, writing in letters and doing the fanzines and stuff. Those guys would pick up on this stuff, right? That same creature appears at the end, of Haunter of the Ring as well, right? It doesn't fully materialize. It's like starting to appear, and it's like more of a shadow amorphous form, right? But that's what it is.
And the ring also appears in Solomon Kane's Right-Handed Doom.
Potentially, right? I mean, that's earlier.
Described as a different color, right? It's copper or silver.
It's silver, where Thoth-Amon's is copper colored.
Just admiring the fact that that this little relic could proceed through the eras like that. It's used effectively most every time. I really liked it in Phoenix on the Sword because you have a particularly vile villain. After Conan dispatches gorily dozens of memorable villains with Volmana and Ronaldo and whatnot, he dices them up, but the evil villain gets the real treatment of being attacked by the horror from the ring, which is very satisfying, I think, from a pulp reader standpoint.
One creature that I don't hear talked about very often are the ghouls featured in Hour of the Dragon. They're kind of like abominations that have been interbred with other potential beasts, and I know that that's definitely like a concept that has been played with throughout pop culture as well. So I'm not sure if Howard originated that idea. Maybe he just needed a quick monster, but it is quite chilling.
Well, Lovecraft had ghouls too, right? And so that may have been what he was pulling on to. But yeah, they're cool. I mean, the term ghoul usually meant these undead creatures that eat other dead bodies, right? Is kind of the thing, right? They that's how the term was originally like used for people that were body snatchers, in the 1800s or whatever. So it was around that idea, and it's a great question. When did that evolve into what we think of now as a monster that like eats other dead bodies or whatever? Almost, I don't know. That's a great question, but yeah, Howard plays with it, and they're cool and chilling, and yeah.
How about vampires? Well, we could call them vampires within Howard's mythos.
I guess we're still heading in the realm of the undead, but before we go there, it struck me that like one of the Conan stories where the villain is a monster would be like Black Colossus and Hour of the Dragon, where the villain is basically an undead sorcerer. Looking back, especially at Black Colossus, it seems to me like this. The climax of Black Colossus seems like to be one of the most imitated things in sword and sorcery, is you have an undead sorcerer about to sacrifice a naked princess on an altar, and the sword-wielding hero busts in and saves the day.
Look at this.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
There
right?
it is. Ooh, yeah.
It's Zoltan as the only action figure has ever made.
That is
throw these out, and I'm like, give me that. You're not going to throw that out.
I mean, you're absolutely right. Like, come to think of it, I can't think of any precursors to that scene that, you're right, has become, iconic, right?
Seriously, man, if you ask Joe Schmo to imagine the sword and sorcery scene, something like that's probably going to be what pops into his head.
Always, right? Well, because it very much became a D&D thing, right? You see it on the cover or the back of the like player's handbook and all. And that's, again, not coincidence, right? Because Gygax, all those guys were big Howard fans and read all this stuff. Yeah, that's an interesting thing. I wonder, is there anything before that? And that may be the Ur moment for that scene. Come to think of it,
and we've been seeing undead sorcerers harass people ever since.
And you're not wrong. Well, and making the comparison between Thugr Kotan in Black Colossus and Zutlatan in Hour of the Dragon, that's not coincidence, because Hour of the Dragon was, again, it was originally written for a very different audience. It was written for a British audience, He had pitched it as a novel that was going to be sold in the United Kingdom, and that ended up falling through. And so he ended up, they ended up getting serialized in Weird Tales for an American audience. But originally this goes back to where I was saying, Howard's often writing for his Weird Tale regulars, right? For once, he's got a chance to write a Conan novel to a totally different audience that has never seen any of the other Conan stories. And so he cherry picked some of the best stuff from some of his stories. So you get pieces of that. That's why Hour of the Dragon feels like a greatest hits kind of thing, because it is. It's Scarlet Citadel. It's Black Colossus. It's, Queen of the Black Coast. It's, there's elements in there. He cherry picked a lot of the best stuff from his stories, or what he probably thought was the best stuff. And I probably wasn't wrong, and put it all together into this one long novel that he thought was selling. He was selling it to a completely different audience, and he could get away with it. But that's why Zusultan is basically, a ramped up version of Thugru Khotan, right? It's not a coincidence. But he created like iconic characters there. The necromancer sorcerer that's like raised from the dead, what we would today call a lich, right? From D&D.
Just because its plot structure owes so much to so many of his previous works, I don't think this is a strike against Hour of the Dragon really at all. I think it contains some of Howard's best prose and some really memorable moments. Just read the opening chapter. Just read the first few paragraphs. That when they're raising Zaltotin on that ridiculously atmospheric night scene, that's just wonderful.
It really was some of his best work, like intentionally. He is what it is. It is greatest hits, and that there's nothing wrong with that.
Well, how about Akavasha? She's like a vampire. Yeah, right? Like, let's get to the vampire.
Another character that had like impact far beyond one would think for the number of pages devoted to her. I mean, she's not really around very long in Hour of the Dragon, yet everybody remembers Akavasha.
Yes, absolutely. I suspect there may, especially because of the similarities in names, that he may have been influenced by Ayesha. From the H. Rider Haggard novel, She, right? Again, while Ayesha wasn't a vampire per se, she was this immortal, the sort of trope of the evil queen of a lost civilization kind of thing, right? And Howard certainly read Haggard, no question. So he would have been familiar with that character. But like Howard, this is what he does. He'll take a cool thing, that was from one of his favorite writers, and he'll go to a dark place with it. Just having this immortal, femme fatale character is not enough. We got to make her a dark, evil vampire too, right? That's what Howard does, right? He'll take something cool from like Burroughs or whoever, and he'll go really dark with it.
And he'll make it cooler is what he will do.
Yeah, exactly.
We mentioned earlier the pre-human races, and we kind of talked a little bit about werewolves, but I want to push a little further on that. There's no werewolves like in any Conan story, but Howard does write about them in at least two other stories. What can you tell us about werewolves within this mythos that Howard established?
Again, in that one line in the Shadow Kingdom, where, they're talking about all these pre-human races. They mentioned the wolf people, or in fact, he says most of them are all gone now, except for the serpent people and a few of the wolf people. Like, why do that? Right? Like, why did he say that? Well, a couple of his earlier stories, as you alluded to, were actually werewolf stories, right? And in fact, they were the very beginning of his career. Right after Spear and Fang, his first published story that we talked about, his second and third published stories were werewolf stories. In the village, in the forest of Villafare and Wolfshead. And they're both the same character, Demontour, right? And in the first story, Demontour, he's a warrior, and it takes place circa 1500, roughly. It's kind of hard to date, right?
He's the original Bill Bixby Hulk.
He is. Well, that's kind of, you get that in Wolf's Head, right? So in the first story, he becomes a werewolf. He ends up fighting a werewolf, and Howard has a different take on werewolves. It's not a disease like lycanthropy, like you get in a lot of stories. If you kill a werewolf, it's really, a werewolf is something that's possessed by this demon-like wolf spirit that makes you transform. And if you kill a werewolf, that spirit can come into you and possess you, rather than it being like a bite and a werewolf disease or something like that, right? So it's different. Again, Howard always likes to do a different take on, traditional monsters, traditional things, right? He does his own thing with it. Montour in the first story, this is what happens. He kills a werewolf. He ends up getting possessed by the wolf spirit and becomes a werewolf himself at the very end. In the sequel, Wolf said it takes place like 20 years later or whatever. And it's a wild story on the African coast in a Portuguese fortress, which is probably why it's like 1490s, 1500ish or whatever. And here he's already been a werewolf for years, and he tells a story, he eventually gives his backstory, and he's been traveling around the world trying to rid himself of this curse for years, before he finally ends up here in Africa. And it is like the Bill Bixby Hulk, right? It's this, the monster that's trying, the human that has this monstrous curse that he's wandering around trying to free himself of the curse, except we don't get to see any of that.
Sounds like someone needs to write a Savage Sword story about this, Jeff.
I don't know what you're talking about, man.
It's a fun character. I'm anxious to see more of it.
I may have taken that as a story prompt and run with it. We'll see. I may have I feel like I may have just given John some ideas too. I can see what his eyebrows raised there.
I'm looking forward to following through on that if there's anything to it.
We've talked ghouls, we talked vampires and werewolves, all the classics. Howard had a hand in all of them, and at least his versions of it. But at least within Howard's canon, because then I want to get to some cool pastiche monsters that were created by you, Mr. Hocking.
We all know there's only one good pastiche Conan writer. We all know this.
That's not true, but thank you anyway.
Well, all right, Karl Edward Wagner too, but also you.
Let's talk about the black ones from the pool of the black ones. They're pretty cool. Pretty cool story, pretty cool creatures. What are your thoughts?
What are these ebon-skinned, taloned, golden-eyed guys that got the hobby of turning people into statues of petrified bone? That's those guys, right? It's an odd Conan story, and that's an odd foe. What do you make of them, Jeff? I mean, do you know where these guys come from?
I can guess, right? Because you also get a variation of them in Iron Shadows in the Moon, right? Except in one, they're kind of giant size. The other, they're more man size. But it seems like they're kind of supposed to be the same thing. They've got these green stone cities and stuff too, right? What he talks about.
Wait, they have green stone cities?
They did, yeah.
That's Kasalan, maybe, from the old Kasalan Empire. So Jeff and I did one in the Hyborian nations. We realized that Zuchodl, Zuthal, and then Kasala also has like green temples, right? They're built, and so maybe they're part of a Kasalan empire. And maybe I'm just, fishing here, but maybe it's all connected.
It may all be connected. It's the kind of thing Howard would do, even if he wasn't doing it like fully, right? I mean, he's kind of like weaving these elements together, even if even if he hasn't fully worked it out in his head, what he's trying to do, right? Talking about where he gets it from, there's a couple of possibilities. There's the Burroughs and the Mars stories. There is the black race of Mars, right? So that's one possibility. It may also be coming from Theosophy. And he was reading some theosophical works and stuff too, I think.
Blavatsky, yeah.
Yeah. I don't think he ever read Blavatsky directly, because who could? It's kind of gibberish. But
thank you. I tried. It was very hard. Yeah.
It's very hard, right? But there were a number of other writers that tried to take her stuff and put it into a more readable, popular context, like William Scott Elliott and its Story of Atlantis and Lost Cimmeria that Lovecraft cites in Call of Cthulhu, right? And Howard was reading some other stuff. And in Theosophy, that's where you get this idea of these sort of pre-human races like Hyperboreans and Lemurians and Atlanteans and all of that. And each one of them have sub-races, and some of them have different colored skins and things like that. And it doesn't necessarily translate to our modern concept of race exactly. Like, and that's, you get the idea of that with Howard when he's describing them as having black skin, right? But they're black skinned not in necessarily a human way, like someone of African descent, right? It's more alien than that, right? And it's more, which ties in more with like the Black Martians, right? Of Burroughs, right? So that may be, so he may be getting that idea from there, but it plays into his use of Theosophy and how he would just kind of take those concepts of these pre-human races that just aren't quite like us, and that's what he was probably doing with the black ones,
Well, am I missing anything else within Howard's canon? Is there anything else before we move on? Can you guys think of anything we skipped over?
I made a note about Zogar Zag from Beyond the Black.
Yeah.
It's just because the demonic brother that shows up at the climax, and this is a really memorable and almost completely demonic sort of a foe. Little the way it looks, the way it acts, and most of all, I had to write this down. The way he talks. He Conan said, "I saw you in the swamps. You went by as like a blue flame, and like, why didn't you kill me then?" And he lays down that, well, my brother had not painted a skull black for you and hurled it into the fire that burns forever on Gulla's black altar. He had not whispered your name to the black ghosts that haunt the uplands of the dark land. But a bat has flown over the mountains of the dead and drawn your image in blood and the white tiger's hide that hangs before the long hut where sleep the four brothers of the night. Oh, says Conan. Well, hell, that explains it.
That explains it.
That is some wonderfully fantastical, eerie, impossible to understand thinking on the part of a demonic entity coming to fight you. And it's one of the rare occasions where I think Howard actually makes like an otherworldly being speak. I mean, you got Kasha, but it's a world apart from that.
That makes it creepy as hell too.
Doesn't it though? It's like, I can't understand it. Well, that's okay. You can't understand it. You are unable.
Right. You're not really supposed to. Right.
Yeah. Your brain isn't going to work that way. I'm going down pathways that humans just are ill-equipped to do.
And that prose is very Clark Ashton Smith there too.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh yeah. Clearly influenced by his Weird Tales books.
Very much so. You mentioned in that story, I think one of the things we had talked about, maybe talking about too, were like things like saber-toothed tigers and stuff that show up in that story too, right? Again, it's that idea of, the Hyborian age isn't really prehistoric. We're just getting into, it's kind of into the last ice age, roughly, whatever. But you have relic prehistoric creatures in there, right? In one of the stories, mammoths are mentioned, so, that's something that, I think is maybe sometimes, kind of not thought about or not forgotten, that you get these relic megafauna, creatures too, right? We talked about the dinosaurs. We talked about Neanderthals, relic ones, right? There's only a few of them left. They're the last of their kind.
Fight a giant sloth.
The giant sloths were kind of cool, though. I would hate to see him kill a giant sloth.
Yeah, this was slow,
Yeah.
His panther speed would be just outmatched dramatically.
Right.
There was a sloth horror movie that came out. I haven't seen it yet.
Seriously?
Yeah, it was like a sloth slasher. God, I forget the name. It was supposed to be a comedy, but it was pretty funny. I got to check it out.
So like cocaine mare, it's like meth megatherium or something, like, right? Yeah, hell yeah.
Well, it's no secret that we're developing a Cull comic series right now, and that's one of the things that Chris mentioned that he's keeping in mind is like we're developing the Thurian age visually, like what kind of prehistoric or cool creatures can we throw into scenes or stories or in the background, and that's pretty fun because if you traveled to Earth millions of years ago, you might as well be on an alien planet. There's so much completely different,
and the Cull stories take place 100,000 years ago. I think a lot of people that remember the Marvel comics think Cull was, Conan was 10,000 years ago. Cull was 20,000 years ago. That's because Marvel compressed it up to fit with their timeline, right?
It's like 100,000 years ago, right?
100,000 years ago, right? Or to use Howard's phrase, 1,000 centuries.
Yes, 1,000 centuries.
Because he's always more poetic about it, right?
Well, let's move on
Sounds
to
better
you,
that
Mr.
way.
Hocking, the Emerald Lotus. Let's start with that. Where was the influences? What influenced you to create your monster? Yeah, where did it all come from?
It's a bunch of ideas came together. I wanted to create a unique sorceress menace, and I wanted to have a reason to get Conan involved in the story, and I wanted to have something that the sorcerers would strive for. That was, something that they would fight over. There wouldn't be a magic sword or a magic ring. There would be something a little more realistic. And I've read a lot of crime fiction and detective pulp, and it seemed like I grew up in the 70s outside Detroit, so it seemed like it being a drug it seemed like a logical sort of extension. And the more I thought of it, and I've never really gone into this with anybody except for maybe my family, but long ago I conceived that there was going to be a drug that the sorcerers would fight over. But way back in the day, I had a terrible nightmare, and I was on I was on a circular balcony, like a building that was like a shaft, and there's a hole in the center. The balcony ran around the outside of the shaft, and it was very, very dark, and there were people all around me fighting brutally, like with weapons, and like people were screaming and gasping, and I'm unarmed. I was like, oh my God, what's going on? And there were people falling around left and right. And all of a sudden I heard this horrible, like, rustling sound come from down below the balcony in the total darkness. And I thought, what the hell is that? And I realized something was rising up out of the, out of the shaft. And I thought, oh my God, all these people are fighting. They've got to stop fighting. They got no idea what's coming. Whatever it was that was coming up out of the shaft was much, much more terrifying than the horrible fight in darkness that was going on around me. And I was like, oh, stop, everybody stop, look out, here comes this thing. And I woke up like, all freaked out, wondering what was going on. And I thought, I should be able to use that. And so I just took, like, mentally, it was like the drugs thing in the shaft, drugs thing. They're the same thing. The monster is the drug.
That's the best origin I could hope for. That's awesome.
A number of people have, like, basically collared me and said, what's this just say no story, this anti-drug? The Emerald Lotus is like cocaine, right? No, that's not what the Emerald Lotus is supposed to be. It's more than an anti-drug message. I mean, once the Emerald Lotus to the villain becomes everything. It's what makes him who he is. It's his hopes. It's his dreams. And in the end, it eats him alive. And yeah, there's an element of anti-drug element there, but what it is more than anything else is anti-narcissism, anti-self-absorption. You got to be able to see outside yourself, beyond your own personal goals and your own personal needs. You need to see the world as a whole. Forgive me if I'm going pretentious here, but I have been elbowed a couple times pretty heavily about the drug aspect in that story, and I want it to be more than just an anti-drug message.
Well, John, you're probably ahead of it because, mushroom horror right now is bigger than ever, right? I mean, you got The Last of Us. There's a number of, it's almost a subgenre of horror now, mushroom horror, or the idea of spores or fungi. And even in real life, like, mushrooms are being studied more and more, and all these breakthroughs in science are happening, right? About networks, how mushrooms, like, have it's basically internet for the forests. I think you're just ahead of your time. So to hell with them.
I'm not gonna lie. I was a lot younger. I was probably pretty stoned when I read Emerald Lotus for the first time in, like, the late 90s or whatever that was. I gotta say, that's the old days. So, I'm mostly sober these days, but yeah. And I remember how refreshing it was. Not gonna lie. Such a well done, where somebody finally captured, Conan the way it should be done.
To you, that means a lot.
Well, how about The Living Plague?
The Living Plague came about for me wanting to come up with a really formidable foe for Conan, and thinking about incarnations. He's fought, like, gods and demons and what have you, because Lovecraftian monstrosities. And I thought, what would be one of the most frightening things is you could personify any aspect of life, any negative aspect of life. It would be like a plague. And I just played with the idea of what if something is non-sentient, as that could be incarnated, what would it be like? What would it want? So one of the parts of Living Plague that I found most engaging was imagining the evolution of the Living Plague as it comes to realize what it is and where it's going. And then once I'd created that, I think, how in the world am I going to stop something like that? You can't stab it. You can't cleave it in two. You can't burn it. What can you do? And of course I had, and a climax, which I've been taken to task for being a little bit overly fantastic for a Conan story. Conan has to go elsewhere, in order to find something that can take care of it. So say no more about that. So there's no spoilers for anyone who hasn't Conan the Living Plague yet.
What about the origins for that one? Where did you come up with the idea?
Like I said, I was trying to come up with one of the things about writing a novel-length adventure of the Cimmerian is you have to come up with something that challenges him. And in a short story, it's maybe not that difficult, but it's something that's supposed to hold his attention, and challenge him for 200, 300 pages. It has to be something formidable. And so I thought the best thing is some sort of incarnation, and like an incarnation of a plague seemed like the scariest way to go about it. And I figured, it was an accident. It was like supposed to be a sort of a chemical weapon of the Hyborian age, but the conjuring went wrong, and so it became an incarnation. That all sort of rolled up from there. Once I got the rough idea, then it just expanded into an evolving and increasingly intelligent sort of malevolent force in the incarnated plague.
Well, more once again ahead of your time, more relevant now than ever before. Everyone's, for a right reason, afraid of disease. and we've been through a pandemic, and I know you wrote these stories back in the early 90s before like any of this happened, right? But it's still cool. You're like the Michael Crichton of sword and sorcery.
There you go. The Hyborian strain,
The Hyborian
right?
strain.
Exactly.
There you go. We got to design that. That can be the T-shirt, the Hyborian strain.
There you go.
Well, guys, thank you so much. You anxiously await your next book, John, and Jeff. Same to you. Looking forward to speaking to you more about lore. So thank you so much, guys. Crom back for more next time.